Hi, welcome everybody. This is our second attempt at doing a film talk. My name is Fred Fuchs. I'm the chair of the Westdale Theatre in Hamilton, Ontario. We're about an hour outside of Toronto. And the Westdale Theatre is an independent community theatre, charitable organization. We opened about a year ago. And we're dedicated to bringing the best of independent and art house films, and providing for our community a space where they can also have music events and talks, and it's really worked out quite wonderfully. So while we're closed, we decided we'd launch a series of film clubs, and these are going to be launched tonight, as a matter of fact. And if you go to our website, thewestdale.ca, you'll get information about how you can join. And these clubs will be small clubs. There'll only be 10 to 12 people in each one. They will be based on different genres of films, and they'll be a wonderful place to watch a film during the week and then to get together with your club. There'll be a moderator for each club, and we'll be launching that on the Zoom platform. But we will also do these film talks. My background is as a movie producer, and I've spent my life in the entertainment business. I love movies. I love talking about movies. And this will be a chance to do that. Can everybody hear me okay? Is there any problem with sound or video? I can see all your chats and comments. And besides the talk, I'm also going to give a chance for people to ask questions and talk about how they, their own experience watching the film. So a lot of the information is kind of well known about this film. It's everywhere. It's one of the most famous films, of course, of all time. But a lot of the information I'm going to share tonight actually came from a wonderful book that's been published recently. It's called The Big Goodbye, Chinatown in the Last Years of Hollywood, by Sam Wasson, and highly recommend the book if you're really interested in this period of Hollywood and want to hear more about it. So before we start talking about the film, I wanted to give you some context for the Hollywood world at the time that Chinatown was made in 1974. The first half of the 1970s was really the last years of Hollywood as it was known up until then. The film industry had been suffering for years. The old Hollywood studio system, contract system, was gone, and TV was becoming huge and getting all the attention. And big corporations were buying up the studios. But there was this one last golden moment, really the late 60s up until around 1975, where, in my opinion, some of the most extraordinary films ever made were done, and done by some of the great directors who, of course, were young at the time and have continued to be the great directors. What had happened was that the studios had been bought by corporations, and they'd put in a group of young studio heads. There was Robert Evans at Paramount, who was 35, and John Cowley at Warner Brothers, David Picker at Universal, Darryl Zanuck Jr. was at Fox. These were all men under 40 years old. But they actually knew about films, they loved films, and they were willing to work with these creative new directors and young directors and really do something fantastic. The directing talent was extraordinary. This was when Francis Coppola and Mike Nichols, Roman Polanski, Milos Forman, Hal Ashby, John Schlesinger, George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, Martin Scorsese were all really making some of their best movies and really starting their careers. And the beauty of the time was these studio heads really had total control. And they really supported these directors, and producers actually weren't that important because all the financing was coming from the studio. The deals could be made quickly. The actors weren't terribly expensive, and the budgets weren't that high. The budget for The Godfather in 1971 was $6 million. The budget for Chinatown was $6 million. So there wasn't the same kind of pressure, the same kind of financial analysis that had to go through. And these were committed filmmakers who were really trying to preserve cinema. You know, TV was coming and getting bigger and bigger, And they wanted to make films. They wanted to, you know, make experiences that people saw at a movie theater, and really had that kind of experience that they were afraid might be dying, and it certainly has transformed in the last 30 years, as we know. And so for Nicholson, you know, Jack Nicholson, who starred in the film, and Polanski, the director, and Robert Evans, who was the producer, not just the studio head, but he was also the producer of Chinatown, they really saw this movie as a chance to do that, you know. And cinema is a different experience than TV, and it was very strange for me to watch Chinatown on my TV set this week. I, of course, saw it in the theater when it came out in '74, because it's a different commitment you make as an audience to be watching a film. You know, at a movie theater, you are committed for the entire time, and this filmmaker can use the pace of the film to work with you. And if you remember, the pacing in Chinatown is quite extraordinary, because it actually starts quite leisurely. And we drive around town, and we get to see, you know, a divorce case, and meet the characters. But as it gets going, because they're not afraid people are going to change the channel or, you know, walk out of the room, the pace gets faster and faster, and then the plot twists and the intense drama scenes start piling up, and the tension just keeps building so fast, and you almost have time to catch your breath. So very different. I'm not sure how this story would have played out if it was being made for Netflix. So where it all started, of course, Chinatown was with the writer, Robert Towne. One of, you know, the greatest screenwriters in Hollywood. He's been writing, he's still writing, he's also a director, and he grew up in Los Angeles. He knew that world. He obviously wasn't born in '37 when the film took place, but he was very aware of what Los Angeles was, how it had transformed over World War II. And it was sort of a nostalgic look back at the world of Los Angeles in 1938, and a world that was disappearing rapidly. And he grew up around Hollywood. He was an actor himself, actually, and that's how he first met Jack Nicholson. And they both worked for, you know, the B-movie king, Roger Corman, back in the mid-'60s. And he went up to visit Nicholson in Oregon, where Nicholson was directing a movie. Jack Nicholson directed 3 movies, as a matter of fact, called Drive, he said. And that's when Towne started reading the Raymond Chandler detective novels, watching film noir movies, and read an incredible book about the history of California related to the water rights, which we're going to talk about, because, as you know, that was sort of the background plot of the movie. And he thought about the title Chinatown and describes it as sort of, it was a state of mind that he was trying to capture in the film. In fact, in the original script, there are no scenes that actually take place in Chinatown. There's a little bit of a conversation, because obviously Jake, you know, had worked in Chinatown at one point. Someone asked, "What did you do in Chinatown?" And the answer is, "As little as possible." But of course, there's never a great explanation of what happened when Jake worked there, and it really didn't matter, because that wasn't what the intention of the title was. Towne at the time was the king of the script doctoring. He had worked on Bonnie and Clyde. Some people don't know, he's actually did script writing on The Godfather, uncredited. He was nominated for an Academy Award for The Last Detail in 1973. And then, of course, Shampoo in 1975, and then many, many films since then. And Towne was good friends with Nicholson, and always and wrote the movie for Jack Nicholson to star in. There was never any question who was going to play the lead, and Nicholson at the time was at the height of his powers, and we'll talk a little bit about him in a minute. But even before Nicholson, the most important character, of course, was Robert Evans. And Robert Evans is, you know, lived quite a long time. He only recently died, and later in life did a lot of unusual films as a producer. But during this period of time, from 1968 to 1975, when he was the head of Paramount Studios, he made just extraordinary movies. He really trusted directors, and he brought a studio, Paramount Studios, which had been completely destroyed, basically. It was the number 9 studio in the pecking order. And Evans had never run a studio. He was an ex-actor, actually, as I said. He was in his in the 1950s, he was chosen by Norma Shearer to play Irving Thalberg, her husband, Man with a Thousand Faces. But he was from New York, and he was sophisticated, and he could really talk the talk. And some of the movies he made at Paramount included his first big commercial success was Love Story, which also starred Ali MacGraw, who was his wife at the time, especially until she ran off with Steve McQueen, which was a whole nother story. And then, of course, Chinatown and Godfather, Godfather 2, and Day of the Locust, and many other great films that he supervised. And he approached Robert Towne because he was interested in adapting The Great Gatsby to a film, and offered him Towne $175,000, which was quite a bit of money to rewrite it. And Towne declined. He didn't want to be known as the Hollywood writer who fucked up a literary classic. So instead, Bob Evans actually hired Francis Coppola, and he wrote the script for The Great Gatsby that was later made with Robert Redford, and not a terribly great success. But instead, Towne pitched the idea of doing Chinatown. And although he really just had an idea, and it was going to be, of course, a film noir and a mystery thriller, there wasn't a lot done. And Evans offered him $25,000, and he accepted it. But we don't have to feel too sorry for Towne, because he did get another $250,000 when it was made, and also 5% of the gross, which turned out to be a fair amount of money. So let's see, what else? Chinatown. So we all know the basic story. It's set in 1937. It portrays the manipulation of this critical resource, water, by a cadre of shadowy oligarchs. It was actually going to be the first of a trilogy that Towne had planned, and we were going to follow this character, this detective, private detective J.J. Gittes, through all of these different stories over time. Unfortunately, there was one sequel made, The Two Jakes, but without without Roman Polanski, and it was not terribly successful. So the original script finally came in, and it was about 180 pages long. It had tons of additional characters. It was certainly had some fantastic scenes, and everyone was excited about it, but no one really knew what to make of it, and they certainly didn't know what to make of this title, Chinatown. And several directors turned it down. It was first offered to Arthur Penn. Warren Beatty, who was friends with all of them, also thought about directing it first. And eventually someone had the idea, I guess it was Evans, to send it to Roman Polanski. Now, Polanski had just done a movie for Paramount, his first movie in Hollywood that was incredibly successful, called Rosemary's Baby. And that was a tremendous experience for everybody, and a very financially successful film. But even Polanski didn't particularly like the script, but he did like the idea of a detective story in the period, and this idea of doing a story about this time and place. Now, Polanski, of course, had had a very complicated life. At the time, he was living in London in a dark, dark place. He grew up he was born in Paris, but grew up in Poland and survived World War II. He was in the Krakow ghetto at 7 years old. Both his mother and father were taken away. Mother died in Auschwitz. Polanski managed to escape and was hidden by a Roman Catholic family and was able to survive the war. And he started making films in Paris and in Europe, and was really a genius. He was just one of the most brilliant filmmakers we've had in this generation or any. And in fact, he's still alive and making unbelievable movies still today at 80 years old. But he did come to Hollywood for Rosemary's Baby. He was tempted to see what he could do there, and it was a huge success. And he developed a loyal team that worked with him on his other films. And the film he was making just before he came to Hollywood was called The Fearless Vampire Killers, which he also starred in. And his co-star was an incredible young actress named Sharon Tate. And Sharon Tate became his wife, and they had quite an exciting life in Hollywood. Any of you who've seen Once Upon a Time in Hollywood got a glimpse of what that world was like at the time and what Sharon Tate was like at the time, played by Margot Robbie. And Sharon was pregnant, and 9-month pregnant. And but Roman was a filmmaker, and he was in London at the time developing Day of the Dolphin, which was later made by Mike Nichols with George C. Scott. But and was, of course, therefore not there. He was about to return in literally days when Sharon was murdered by the, not like Tarantino's movie, she was murdered by the Manson family. And of course, it was the most devastating thing that could have happened to anybody. And this is, of course, a kid who had already survived, World War II. And it left him in a place where he didn't work for a while. He made one small film in London. Polanski's one quote that I thought particularly interesting from this period was, "Our destinies are the result of apparently meaningless coincidences." But he was lured back, and he did come back, and he had incredible passion for film. He had incredible experience for film. He was just a masterful director. He understood camera. He understood editing. He understood everything, every detail, every single scene, every shot, no matter how small. He knew what he wanted. And his casting, he knew how to cast. He knew it wasn't the best actor, but the best actor for what he needed in the role. And Polanski started to work on the script. Gave a bunch of notes to town, went away again. The changes weren't happening, so he had to sit down ultimately and really start working on the script himself. Often people say that Polanski really should have deserved a screenplay credit, and I'll give you some of the examples of things he changed in the film, but that was just not what Polanski did, and so he never took any credits. So the first big decision that he made was the original screenplay had a whole number of characters, and besides of course Jake, and also all sorts of subplots, a lot more detail about the water wars, a lot more relationship stuff that ultimately all was lost. And the basic decision that he made was not unlike the Raymond Chandler books, that Polanski decided the whole film would be told through Geddes' point of view, through the detective's point of view, and that it would never deviate from that, and we would only experience the world and the story in the same way that he experienced it himself. And, and again, the title Chinatown, was something Polanski was interested in. Nobody really kind of had made it work yet. To him, it represented the futility of good intentions. But ultimately, of course, Polanski did write a scene, the final scene of the movie, that did take place in Chinatown, which made it, in a sense, more than just a metaphor, since originally there was no action at all in Chinatown. And there was no love scene in the movie either. Although Evelyn Mulwray and Jake Geddes fell in love, there wasn't this beautiful love scene, incredible love scene that was really something Polanski put together. And then, of course, the other huge change was the ending of the movie. And this was something that Town and Polanski fought about on and on and on into the production of the film. And in fact, Town ultimately left the film, and Polanski finished it and wrote the ending of the film without him. And Town wanted, of course, Noah Cross to die and Evan Mulwray to survive. And but Polanski kind of insisted on a tragic ending. He knew this film could be special and not just another thriller where the good guys, triumph over the bad guys in the final reel. That Evelyn had to die. One speculates, of course, about his own blonde, star, Sharon, and of course who did die, and how much and how personal a lot of what happens and the emotions of the film. But of course, in retrospect, everyone really, thinks that it is this ending that truly elevates the film, and again, metaphorically, represents what the film is truly about. And then, of course, his own personal tragedy, the guilt and shame of the reality of what happened, and of course went on with his different, young girls and sex, and ultimately his trial, and he fled the country, and of course Chinatown was the last film that Roman Polanski ever made in the U.S. Of course, he went on to make many, many films in Europe. So let's talk about a little bit about the casting of the film, and of course we'll start with Jack Nicholson. And Jack Nicholson was always really thought of as one of the best actors of the period, but this was the film that everyone saw and solidified his, greatest actor of the generation. And Nicholson had started with, Roger Corman, of course. There's the famous Little Shop of Horrors that was shot in 3 days. But first really came on the scene with Easy Rider in '69 and Five Easy Pieces in 1970 and King of Marvin Gardens and Carnal Knowledge and The Last Detail. But this was his first big starring role. And he loved clothes, he loved the look, he loved everything about playing this part and in this romantic story. And he really is the one who kind of kept this film all together, especially with Faye Dunaway, who was his co-star. Faye was very much Nicholson's choice for that part. And although she had a reputation of being very difficult, and the battles that she had with Polanski are legendary, he kept pushing her and did ultimately get Polanski and everyone to agree to cast her. The actress that the studio actually wanted was Jane Fonda, who was very hot at the time. But Polanski also felt the same way and always insisted on Dunaway, even though she was going to be ideally difficult, but for playing the period and, this kind of classic Black Widow type character. And ultimately, of course, Evelyn is the only selfless person in the entire film, and really is the heart and moral soul of the film in many ways. She was, burst on the scene, of course, with Bonnie and Clyde in 1967, and, had done a few other good movies, Thomas Crown Affair and The Arrangement, and was shooting The Three Musketeers at the time. But she, wasn't sure she wanted to do this, but ultimately was talked into it. And she only got paid $40,000 for the role. So, as you know, it was just a very different world at the time. And Bob Evans, of course, recognized how important this role was and this character, and spared no expense. And as you can see, her clothing and her hair and the time for her performances, and everything was given to her that she needed. And she did give, of course, an absolutely remarkable performance and Academy Award nomination, etc. The other main actor, of course, was John Huston. And John Huston is, of course, the famous legendary film director and film screenwriter, long before he even became a director, and was Hollywood royalty. His father was the great actor Walter Huston. I don't know, John Huston, of course, wrote Sergeant York, many other great scripts. And then his first film as a director, coincidentally or not, was The Maltese Falcon, one of the great film noir movies with Humphrey Bogart, set in San Francisco and based on a book by Dashiell Hammett, not by Raymond Chandler, but certainly cut of the same role. Huston often talked about this being, the best role of his life, and certainly his performance was absolutely extraordinary in the film. Another strange intersection here, or synchronicity, was that his daughter, Angelica, who was 21, had just recently become Nicholson's girlfriend. And Nicholson was 36 at the time and a notorious womanizer. But when Noah Cross talked about, Jake having sex with his daughter, he really was having sex with his daughter, not just in the movie. And anyhow, Nicholson really brought his game to the film and helped raise and elevate everybody's performances. So production started in 74, and it was an amazing time then at Paramount, you know, from a studio that 6 years ago had actually left the lot and was working out of offices on Cannon Street. They were back on the lot, and the lot was absolutely humming. Chinatown was shooting just down the street in another stage, Godfather 2. Day of the Locust was shooting at the same time. It really was, again, some incredible things were going on in Hollywood. And I think the talent all knew that. And there was a passion, a commitment to what they were doing and to, you know, making great cinema that was kind of extraordinary. And again, Polanski was the genius director, and he just had total control. He knew everything he wanted. He would take the time to do what he needed to do. They had 68 days of shooting. The first scene of the first day is an example, and it was the scene that takes place out in the orange grove, where Jake is trying to find an old farmer to tell him, you know, find out more about what was happening, how the land was being built up, and he's sort of attacked, and a guy hits him over the head with a crutch, and he's laying on the ground, and Polanski goes in for the close-up, and they spent about 40 minutes doing this close-up because Polanski had to make sure that the ant was crawling across Nicholson's face at exactly the right time and the right angle for the shot. And so this was your star lying in the dirt waiting till the ant was in the right place. But, you know, these are the kind of stories about what happened. As I said, you know, this was, everybody was top of the game. Richard Silbert was the production designer, an old-timer, fantastic production designer, nominated for Academy Award, you know, was very trusted, really helped, you know, bring the whole crew together. He also had worked on Rosemary's Baby. For the cinematography, Polanski originally wanted William Fraker, who he had worked with before, but Evans was worried that Polanski, using his own cinematographer, would have too much control or something, and Evans really pushed another great photographer instead, Stanley Cortez. And Stanley Cortez, of course, had shot films like Magnificent Ambersons for Orson Welles, and, you know, one of the great photographers of the time. Unfortunately, that was not a good marriage, and clearly after the first few days, it wasn't going to work out, and Evans understood it as well, and instead they brought in a very exciting young photographer named John Alonzo, who of course went on to do many great films. He had been discovered doing a small movie called Harold and Maude. He had documentary experience. He knew how to use the new Panavision cameras, and he could work with a small crew and work fast. And his work on the film was extraordinary, and as I said, nominated for Academy Award. And the whole feeling of the film, it's dry. You know, you feel hot. You feel the heat as you watch this film. This is about water and the desert that is Los Angeles. And when you see the water at times, it's very dramatic, but the way they use the color palette, the way they use the lighting was really quite extraordinary. And something, you know, of course, on the big screen, you can appreciate that much more. A good example, of course, of how everything's from Gittes's point of view, but is even when he has a phone call. We hear his voice or the voice, but we never see the person at the other end. And another example is when he gets knocked unconscious in the Orange Grove, and you know, the movie fades out with him, and it fades to black until he wakes up. You know, kind of a classic film noir technique, but still something that Polanski often did. And because he wanted to emphasize we're seeing everything from Gittes's perspective, often the shots, the camera's right behind Nicholson, and we see his back and shoulders, and we're following him along, and or we're driving, but we're always sitting behind him when we're driving. A great example of that use of perspective is the scene when Jake goes to the house where the daughter's been being kept, and we follow him sneaking around the house. We're behind him, and then as he goes to the window, we dolly in, and suddenly we're looking through the window from his POV, and we see the girl for the first time. Very dramatic. There was a lot of duality that appears in the film, where you have an image that has two parts, one broken and one whole. If you remember the glasses, the bifocals that are found in the pool, there's one smashed glass, there's one clear glass. Of course, Nicholson's face with one of his nostrils slit, one perfectly healthy. The lights on the back of the car when he goes out and breaks the rear light on Evelyn's car so he can follow her at night. Many really, really intricate and genius cinematography elements, all really done by Polanski, who just was a master at this. Obviously, traditional film noir lighting, very contrasty. The initial scene with the Venetian blinds, was certainly a classic. And then, of course, at the end of the film, it's quite extraordinary because it all shifts to handheld camera work during the final shootout in Chinatown. And then, of course, there's the famous crane shot that ends the film. So all of this, there were so many just great moments. And again, from the very beginning of the film, even with the credits, and that incredible score, that trumpet theme, we'll talk about that a little later in post, but it already established and put you in the right mood for what was about to happen. It was not an easy shoot. Polanski was not an easy director to work with. Nicholson had actually been back in Los Angeles for only 3 days when he had to start working. He had just finished doing The Passenger with Antonioni and was completely exhausted, and it usually takes him a little time to get into his character, but he just jumped into it, and then as the film progressed, he managed to figure out where he was. Of course, in the opening scene, you see Jake smoking and smoking cigarettes throughout. Nicholson had actually given up smoking cigarettes for 10 years, but from smoking on this film, I understand he started smoking again and has been smoking ever since. And of course, the clothes we talked about, everything was so important to him, especially the hat, the ties, the suits. These were all, things Nicholson was directly and very carefully involved in. And because it was very important, again, that he wanted to make this kind of real cinema, glamorous movie, not just some TV movie, which were becoming so popular. Another brilliant story point was how he set up Noah Cross before we even meet him. We hear people talking about him. We see pictures of him in newspapers. It's this extraordinary suspense. When do we get to meet him? Who is this guy? What's he going to be like? It was quite beautifully done. And of course, some things happened because they were accidents, and it certainly suits the character of this rich evil man not to care whether he even gets the dumb detective's name right. He constantly is calling, Jake Gitz instead of Gittes. And this was actually not, something he was doing intentionally. Houston just couldn't get the name right. And after a while, Polanski just gave up, and he gave Nicholson a line of dialogue trying to correct him, and they just let it go. And Cross never calls Gittes by his correct name. And then, of course, Faye Dunaway's introduction, riding bareback on the horse, her look. There was that wonderful moment where they talk about the flaw in one of her iris, the dark spot. That actually, a lot of this came from Town's own stories, own lives. Don't get me wrong, as much as Polanski did a real overhaul on structure and some of the scenes and everything else, much of the great dialogue and great moments did come from Robert Towne. And of course, it's after the love scene, they still call each other Mr. Geddes and Mrs. Mulray. They still don't ever use first names, I don't think, in the movie. And of course, the big scene, the love scene, was incredibly beautifully done. The bandage has come off. Obviously, Faye is topless in that scene, which was a bit of a big deal for a movie star. And, they all knew they were making an R-rated movie, but that was part of, what Polanski's vision for the film was. And everybody was on board. Of course, you may know that Roman Polanski actually appears in the movie. He has a cameo as the gangster who cuts Gittes's nose. Polanski always did plan to play the role, but at the last minute he almost didn't do it because he had long hair and he had to cut his hair, which we cut his hair that morning before they shot the scene. And to do that effect, which was amazing, there was a very special knife that was engineered, and Polanski actually had a lot to do with it. He was a bit of an amateur, craft and engineer as well. And they got it on the first take. It was fantastic. But Polanski did it 12 more times. I'm not sure exactly why, but he seemed to enjoy playing with his actors at times. But working with Faye, of course, there were incredible fights. There was a famous scene, of course, that takes place inside the Brown Derby restaurant. And as they shot it, there was one little loose strand on her hair. And of course, the hair was all very tightly lacquered to her skull, kind of like a Jean Harlow look. And this one light was kind of picking up some light, and Polanski sidled up and just sort of plucked it out of Dunaway's scalp. And she screeched like a rape victim, "Don't you dare, how did you ever do that?" She ran off, that motherfucker pulled out my hair. They had to shut down shooting. There had to be a summit meeting the next day. And it wasn't about the hair, but it was, as Dunaway said, it was the incessant cruelty that I felt, constant sarcasm, the never-ending need to humiliate me. Of course, they did patch it up, and Evans was a master at that and continue, but it certainly wasn't an easy shoot for her. Later on, in fact, he exploded her and said, just say the fucking words. Oh, she wanted to know what her motivation was. He said, just say the fucking words. Your salary is your motivation. And anyhow, she was a very complicated woman. I actually had an opportunity to do a film with her 20 years later. She played in a supporting role in a movie that I did called Don Juan DeMarco. And it was not a big role. But she was very professional and did her job. And we had bigger challenges. The stars were Johnny Depp and Marlon Brando. And in fact, Brando was the one who told us he wanted to cast her as his wife in the film. And then, of course, there's the famous scene where Nicholson finally does get Evelyn to tell him the truth about the daughter. And, the famous dialogue, "She's my daughter, I want the truth. She's my sister, she's my daughter. I want the truth, she's my sister and my daughter." Just brilliant, brilliant sequence. But, of course, it took, it was a fight, and Gittes was sort of slapping it out of her. But Dunaway, from the very beginning of the scene, and again, she and Jack had a great relationship, said, "You have to hit me. There's no way we can fake this. You're going to have to really hit me. I want you to hit me." And he did. And in fact, the bruises on her face would have to be covered up by makeup for them to do the next take again because of the beating she took that day. But her performance in that scene is just extraordinary. So again, then there's the end of the film, of course. In the original version, Mulwray does shoot her father. She kills Noah Cross in the car as they're trying to get away. She gets captured. She's going to spend her life in prison, but the girl gets away. The daughter, Geddes takes the daughter, and does get her away from Noah Cross. Well, of course, he's dead. And Evelyn's going to pay the price by spending the rest of her life in prison. But but Polanski wanted a darker ending. And of course, as you've seen the film, she does take a shot at Dad, but only wounds him. And she winds up herself dead and leaving, Catherine in the hands of this nasty old man. And they battled, and ultimately Town left the film, and Polanski got the scene that he wanted. And you know, again, it's a very interestingly shot scene, very dark, and the use of this handheld camera was not the style of the rest of the film at all, but it really added a lot of intensity with the cops and get us running down to the car, seeing Evelyn dead, swish panning up to Noah Cross, and of course the look on the daughter Catherine's face of horror, and then this very unusual kind of crane shot. You know, it almost is like the last shot of Casablanca as the two friends wander off, but as he heads off with you know, literal, you know, failure. Nothing he did, none of his involvement in this case helped or changed anything, except brought a lot of sorrow to people. And of course, the film, you know, is considered one of the great masterpieces. It's, you know, been in every film institute and best picture, you know, and it just has lived on past, you know, anybody's expectation at the time. When they first started post on the film, there were a lot of editing challenges. Previews did not go well. They didn't seem to, the audience did not seem to get the film. There was a lot of trouble with Faye Dunaway's performance because simply she did so many strange and inconsistent line readings. Polanski was very aware of this, though, and he did many takes and got different versions so he could cut together in the editing room a consistent performance, but often meant, you know, stealing dialogue from one scene and playing it over visuals from a different scene, all the different editing tricks to bring this performance together. The audience felt that it was too long, but the single biggest issue with the film was the score. The musical score. So Polanski had a go-to composer who had done Rosemary's Baby. He had died a few years earlier, so he wound up hiring a composer named Philip Lambro to do Chinatown, a very well-respected, you know, musician in his own right. But the score was somehow too modern. It didn't have enough emotion. Polanski fought and fought to keep the score, but eventually it was replaced. Robert Evans, you know, rejected this, you know, the original effort at the last minute and went to a great young composer at the time named Jerry Goldsmith. And Goldsmith wrote the entire score in 9 days, and it was recorded the next day. Polanski was not even around for the recording. He was quite unhappy about this change. Of course, what made or is what most memorable about Goldsmith's score were these very haunting trumpet solos. And they were played by this very famous Hollywood studio musician named Uan Rasey. He was the studios used to have their own orchestras, and he was MGM's first trumpet. But you know, the music to me really made the movie work. Bring out the emotions, bring out the love story, and everything else. Goldsmith told him at the recording when he played, he said, he told him to play it sexy, but like it's not good sex. So again, what is this movie about? You know, and of course, you know, there's the famous line, "What do you do in Chinatown? As little as possible." So on face value, you could say, well, what does that mean? Well, that means that in a place like Chinatown, where there are tongue wars, you're a detective, you don't speak the language, there are corrupt politics, you can't win, right? There's no way to do your job, and there's no way to get the bad guys. All you can do is get in trouble and piss people off. So the real solution was simply to do as little as possible. And you would often, you know, other times you hear, forget it, Jake, it's Chinatown. And I guess what that means is you can't change things. It's the way things are and the way they will be. And regardless of how much you tilted windmills, you know, things will not change. So it's really a line about the futility of fighting injustices and darkness in the world. And Chinatown is the world, and Jake is everybody. And of course, Noah Cross, what can I say? There are many Noah Crosses in the world today still. And some of his lines were, very true, and they still are. He says to Jake at one point, "Course, I'm respectable. I'm old. Politicians, ugly buildings, and whores all get respectable if they last long enough." And that's exactly what happened. This is based on a true story. Los Angeles, of course, had no water. It's a desert. And the only way the city could grow and become what it is today was diverting water from the Colorado River, particularly to feed the San Fernando Valley, which was, this huge, beautiful part of Los Angeles today. And it was where the orchards were, where a lot of the original wealth of Los Angeles came from. And there was a guy named William Holland, who this character is loosely based on. And these guys did, some horrible things. They did indeed divert water. They starved out the farmers so they could buy all their land for next to nothing. They got the city councilors in Los Angeles to agree to pay the money to build this dam, which was supposedly going to, deliver water to downtown. And instead, they diverted the water to the San Fernando Valley, and this land became worth millions and millions of dollars. And, eventually the city of Los Angeles incorporated the San Fernando Valley into Los Angeles. But, and these, horrible crooks all became, the prominent, patriarchs of the city of Los Angeles, and they're considered, great, people, and they were just as awful as the politicians and corrupt, men we see today running our country, and even worse, they were very aware of who they were and what they did. And there's another incredible line from Noah Cross. He says, "You see, Mr. Gitz, most people never have to face the fact that at the right time and right place, they're capable of anything." So what does that mean, right? That there's no guilt, there's no moral problem. We're just, I'm just human. And if I want to rape my daughter when she's 15, well, I just, I guess I made a mistake or something. And it's just an incomprehensible character. But of course, the way John Huston played it, it didn't become, too extreme. It felt like a real human being saying these words and doing these things. And, and there's a reason, big bad guys in Chinatown are doing big things. And of course, it's never for the money, right? The bad guy's a super rich guy, right? But he's doing it for power, and it is all about power. And, Gittes asks him, then why are you doing this? How much better can you eat? Where can you buy? What can you buy that you can't already afford? And his answer was, the future, Mr. Gitz, the future. Yeah, this is a movie about people doing bad things because they want power after they're dead. Anyhow, when the film came out, it was platformed. It wasn't a giant hit right away, but it did build and had a very successful run in the movie theater. Made almost $32 million, which was quite a bit at the time. And of course, the critics loved it, and ultimately was nominated for 11 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, Film Editing, Art Direction, Costume Design, Best Music Score, Best Cinematography. Of all these awards, though, it only won one, and that was for the Best Screenplay for Robert Towne. Polanski did not think they were going to be winning a lot of awards. He wasn't even there for the Academy Awards. Of course, the great irony is the movie that they lost most of the awards to was The Godfather Part 2, another film done by Paramount, while Robert Towne was in charge. Now, of course, that's a whole other story, but Coppola and Towne had enormous problems working together. In fact, at the Academy Awards that night when Coppola won 3 Academy Awards, he never bothered to thank Robert Evans at all during any of his speeches. Another interesting tidbit is Jack Nicholson actually lost Best Actor not to Al Pacino, but to Art Carney, who was in a little movie called Harry and Tonto. And the Best Actress award that Faye Dunaway did not win went to Ellen Burstyn, who had starred in Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, a Martin Scorsese film. You know, if you look at the reviews even today, you look at Rotten Tomatoes, you know, the famous review site, it has an approval rating of 99%, and 66 out of 67 reviews are positive. And the general consensus is bruised and cynical as the decade that produced it. This noir classic benefits from Robert Towne's brilliant screenplay, director Roman Polanski's steady hand, and wonderful performances from Jack Nicholson and Faye Dunaway. And so anyhow, we have a few more minutes. I'd love to answer any questions. I've been looking at some of the chat as it's gone by. I hope that this has been enjoyable for you guys. We try to keep this to an hour. Yeah, I wonder, someone was talking about the score, and you know, it's true that it, like the movie, was not terribly obtrusive at the beginning. It sort of sneaks up on you as time goes by, but ultimately, you know, the percussion and the trumpet become very noticeable. The intention was indeed to really guide and to help support the emotions of the scenes. This was kind of reaction to some of the not so great early screenings where people felt a little confused or not as emotionally involved as they might have been. Let's see, someone was asking about the color palette. Yes, very, very important. The beiges, grays, earth tones. Alonzo is just a brilliant, brilliant kind of guy. Someone was asking about why using the handheld camera at the end. Well, handheld cameras, of course, really create sort of an immediacy. They kind of put you right into the scene. Polanski was shooting the scene very quickly with the blood and everything else that was happening. And it just gives a very efficient way, an effective way. And again, because it was not a style he used during most of the film, I think it really enhanced that experience. You know, it was. I think it was all. It was really kind of perfect the way he did that. Let's see. Any other quick questions? So again, you know, this is really not what a traditional film club meeting will be. The film club meetings are going to be, you know, 10 or 12 people. So they're going to be interactive. There'll be a moderator who will kind of kick things off, but it's not meant to be a talk kind of like this. However, I will continue to do this. And by the way, if there's anyone who would like to volunteer to do one of these, that would also be great. Next week, I'd like to jump ahead, leave the 70s for a little while, and do a talk about the film Forrest Gump, which can be found on Netflix, and I think has a lot of incredible stories to how that film came about. Of course, it won 6 Academy Awards, Best Picture, Best Actor, Best Screenplay, quite a seminal film for the period. But I do encourage you, if you'd like to join one of our clubs, to go to our website, thewestdale.ca. You can also, of course, ask questions, info at westdale.ca or info@filmclub.ca. And I hope, you know, this is a good experience for everybody. And, you know, we're really trying to do what we can during this crisis to keep people talking about films and build community and try to, you know, try to help out however we can. So it's a lot of fun for me to do this and to see these movies again and to read about them and remember all the great stories and this incredible talent that was working at the time. And I guess if there are no other questions or anything else, I'll sign off and thank you all for joining us. Take care.